So this week is Parshas Vayero, and the sugya we will be discussing today is a fascinating sugya. Not really nogea halacha lamaisa, but it still is an extremely interesting and engaging sugya. So in this week's Parsha, we read about Lot and the story of Lot v'shtei benoisav. In Nozia Chov Gimel Amud Aleph and Chov Gimel Amud Beis, a lengthy sugya, and the essence of the sugya is sometimes when you do a certain act or deed, it could be a mitzvah, it could be an aveira, and it all depends on your kavanah, your intentions, your motives. And Chazal quote a posik of the Novi Hosea, Ki yeshorim darkei Hashem tzadikim yelchu bam v'poishim yekoshlu bam. And there are various different examples the Gemara brings. Two people did the same thing. One is essentially tzadikim yelchu bam. The other is poishim yekoshlu bam. And the Gemara says, Keneged Lot v'shtei benoisav. Hem sheneschavnu l'shem shamayim tzadikim yelchu bam. Hu shelo neschavnu l'shem shamayim poishim yekoshlu bam. And then the sugya brings a concept, Gedoil aveira l'shma. A person can do an aveira, but with pure intentions, l'shem shamayim. Gedoila aveira l'shma me mitzvah shelo l'shma. The Gemara asks, could an aveira ever be greater than a mitzvah? Especially Chazal teaches la'olam yaseh kodem b'torah mitzvahs shelo l'shman metoch shelo l'shman bo l'shman. And the Gemara answers no, an aveira is never greater than a mitzvah, but it compares to a mitzvah. Gedoila aveira l'shma ke mitzvah shelo l'shma. As an example, Chazal bring Yael Eishes Chever Hakeni. She had a relationship with Sisera, which is an illegitimate kesher, but her kavanah was to save Klal Yisrael, to save Yerushalayim from Churban. And Chazal compare her to the Imohis, Sora Rivka Rochaleya, Tevoirach Menoshim Ba'oyel Zu Yael Eishes Chever Hakeni. And that's the topic of our shir today, Gedoila Avera Lishma. So on one hand, it has a kesher with the Parsha Lot v'shtei benoisav, and also Avram, Sora, and Avimelech. It happened twice in the lifetime of Avram. Lech Lecho, Vayero, and in Toldos, it's Yitzchok and Rivka and Avimelech. Imrinu achoisi at. Avram and Yitzchok exposed their wives to a great Avera, Eishes Isha Zinzo. But they did so to save their own lives, and probably that was also similar to Avera Lishma. The others were fully aware that they are not only individuals, they are the Yesod of Klal Yisrael, and the entire future of Klal Yisrael depends on them. So this is our sugya today, Avera Lishma. Is this a relevant concept? Is it a halachic concept that we could make use of? Or is it only something that is totally halachically irrelevant? Chazal never permit an avera lishma. They just speak about a situation that is b'di'eved. Yael Eishes Chever Hakeni, we don't find that she asked the Sanhedrin what to do. She did what she did on her own, and Chazal are mishabeach Bidi Eved Gedoila Avera Lishma. The same with Benois Lot. Two great Gedolim hundreds of years ago relate to the concept of Avera Lishma in a very different context. Both of them come out against a movement. But I, especially I as a Chassid, I can't even mention these two movements Beneshima Achas. Definitely not Toch Kedei Dibur, not even Toch Kedei Shir Ikul. The Ramchal in Sefer Kinas Hashem Tzavois talks about Shabsai Tzvi and his movement, the Mashiach Sheker, Shem Rishon Yirkav. Tens of thousands of Jews went astray, left the fold. Thousands of them converted to Islam. And Shabsai Tzvi uprooted, tore many mitzvahs to shreds based on the argument of he's a prophet, Gedol Aveira Lishma. So the Ramchal explains Gedol Aveira Lishma has no halachic relevance. It was only once Yoel Eishes Chever Hakeni Al Piruach HaKodesh. It has to do with Gilgulei Nishamos, above and beyond the realm of halachic ruling. Rab Chaim Evolozhin Keseroish Kuf Lamed Beis talks about Kat Yedua, and he means the Hasidim. So, in the first generation, second generation of Hasidus, when the Vilna Gaon came out and signed an Acherem against the Hasidim, they said that Hasidim rely on Gedol Aveira Lishma in various different areas. And Rab Chaim Evolozhin says, we cannot rely in any way on Gedol Aveira Lishma. La'acha Matan Torah, there is no such a thing as Gedol Aveira Lishma. It was only Hoiro Asha. Well, Shabsai Tzvi, as I said, tens of thousands left the fold. Tens of thousands were over Aveira. Chassidus, on the other hand, proved itself 300 years almost of chizuk, and only Chassidim were a brick wall against Haskalah and against reform. When Kehillas in Germany, in Hungary, in many other places in Europe just fell, and the reformists took them over, it is only in the Hasidic communities in West Galicia and in Poland that were steadfast in their devotion and dedication to Yiddishkeit. But that's a historic discussion that has nothing to do with the Shir today. I think that Aveira Lishma is a halachic concept which Gedolei Yisrael used from the days of Chazal till the days of the Achronim, and I will explain. But first of all, let's talk about Yoel Eishes Chever Hakeni. She gave herself over to Sisera, and she killed him, and she salvaged Klal Yisrael and Yerushalayim by doing so. And Chazal are doirish l'shevach menoshim ba'oyel tevoirach. Is that a one-time episode? There's a very famous tshuva in the Marikas in Makuf Samach Zayin, but I won't go into the details of the Marik because we have so much to discuss today. I will speak about, I don't know, I didn't count, but approximately 15 different sources. So I don't want to go astray. We will be focused on Aveira Lishma. And the Marik in his tshuva explains that even Gili Aroyis is legitimate if we're dealing with Hatzolas Klal Yisrael. Gili Aroyis is one of Gimel Aveiras Chamidas, Yeherek Val Yavar. But the salvation of the entire people is different. And that was that of Yoel Eishes Chever Hakeni and of Esther HaMalka, who had the same story with Achashverosh. Both Esther and Yoel, what they bared in mind was salvaging Klal Yisrael. Roiv Minyan v'Roiv Binyan. Kuf Chov Zayin Medinois Asher LaMelech Achashverosh and Yerushalayim and Eretz Yisrael in the days of Sisera. That is the opinion of Kuf Samach Zayin Tshuvas Maharik. Tshuvas Beis Yankov, one of the great Achronim 300 years ago. Beis Yankov Siman Ametes deals with a story non-Jews, brutal and cruel Goyim, threatened a Jew. If you don't have a relationship with an Eishes Ish, we'll kill you. And a Jewish woman, an Eishes Ish, B'toim Lev, gave herself over to that person to save his life. And the discussion was, is she also labala or materis labala? But the Beis Yankov writes, She did the right thing regardless. She did the right thing like Yoel Eishes Chever Hakeini, Gedoy Lavera Lishma. And it's a chiddush because he's dealing with an individual. And the din is Yehereg Val Yav. So obviously the Beis Yaakov maintains there's a difference. Every person is required to give away his life for Gimel Aveis Chamuros, but not the life of another. So she was permitted to be Evangeliarois to save another Jew. So the Beis Yaakov writes this principle would apply Gedol Averishma even to a Yochid. Chuvas Noide Biyehuda Maduret Tinyona Yoredea Semakuf Samachanef, the Noide Biyehuda rejects the Beis Yaakov. He confuses him with Shuvos Yaakov that we'll quote just in a moment. But the Noide Biyehuda sides with the Maharik. The heter of Gedol Avoy L'Shmo is only when we're dealing with the salvation of the entire Klal Yisrael, or the majority of Klal Yisrael, definitely not for an individual. Some kind of a compromise between the two extremes is the tshuva of the Shuvos Yaakov. And the Shuvos Yaakov, Chelik Beis Kuf Yud Zayin, deals with another tragic story of a band of robbers, of crooks, befell a group of Jews in the middle of the forest, in the middle of the desert. I don't know where it was, and they threatened to pillage, to rob, and kill them all. And there was a woman amongst them, and she gave herself over to those goyim, and she was successful in saving the entire group. So once again, the question that Shuvos Yaakov deals with, muteres labala or yasura labala, but he also says she did the right thing, and that was a mitzvah, not an aveda, because gedol aveda lishma. And he bases his svor on the same story. Eishes chever hakeini, the Gemara knows it of Chov Gimel. Ateres chachomim, Shalas Chuvas Arboch, Frank 11 as a Chov Tes Lamed, agrees with the Shuvos Yaakov. So we have three different approaches, three different opinions. According to the Beis Yaakov, even to salvage an individual. According to the Shuvos Yaakov, Teres Chom, only Arabim. Marik Noide Biyuna, only the majority of Klal Yisrael. But what we do see from these Chuvas, it was not only once in history, Eishes Chever Hakeini. It was Esther, it was Yoel. It was the story that the Shuvos Yaakov dealt with. It was the story that Beis Yaakov dealt with. A group, an individual, but they all based their rulings on the concept of Avera Lishma. I want to make an interesting argument now. It'll be a chiddush to many, but I'm convinced that what I say is very poshut. We do find four sugyas in which Chazal and the Rishonim don't use the concept, the words Gedol Avera Lishma, but a similar concept. And I think it's the same, two sides of the same coin. And what I mean is, Eis Lasois La Hashem, Haferus Sorosecha. Pshuto Shel Mikra is, when many people are not observant, and when so many people are lax with their devotion to Yiddishkeit, that is the time for Chizuk. That is the time to rise to the challenge. But Chazal also offer an alternate interpretation. Sometimes we need to do an Avera if it is called for. We need to do an Avera. When the motive, when the circumstances are four different sugis that I want to quote and briefly deal with. The most fundamental source is the Mishnah Brochas Nun Daled. Hitkinu shei odem shoel chaveiro b'shem, and then the Mishnah brings the posek aferes ersecho eis lasos l'shem. Rashi says, it is a rabbinical prohibition to greet another person b'shem Hashem. Mishum chashash moitz Hashem shomayim levatolo. So Rashi writes, Hitiru, and that is based on a posek in Megillas Rus. Shei shoeles chaveiro b'shem mishum eis lasos l'shem. Rashi writes, when it's eis lasos l'shem, mutar lasos masa shenir'a ke'isur. So Rashi explains, we're not dealing with an Avera. We're dealing with something that is nereka Avera. something similar to Marasai and to Chashda. So it's not a Chiddush at all. But that's the Mishnah. At the end of the Masechet, Samach Gimel, the Gemara quotes the Mishnah, and the Gemara brings a different discussion, and Rashi in the Gemara writes, Kegon Eliyahu Bahar HaKarmel. That's the story of Eliyahu Novi and Aviyah Bar Bahar HaKarmel, and Eliyahu was over on an Aveda Diuraisa. Kochim Bebomo. It was Shas Isur Bomois. And Eliyahu was Makrav Kochim Bechutz. Why did he do so? To expose Nevi'ei Habal, their falsehood, their sheker, and that is Eis Lasis L'Shem Eferes Erusecha. But that example, once again, is not something we could emulate. That's the koyach of a Novi. And the Gemara says in Yevamos Daf Tzadik that a Novi has the authority in two conditions. Migdal Milsa, which means Chizuk Adas, Hoyroas Shah. This still doesn't prove that we could apply this principle in later generations. Maybe it is only a Novi, Mepi Hashem, Beruach HaKodesh. That brings us to source number 2, which is Yumis Samachtes Amadalaf. Yumis Samachtes Amadalaf, the Gemara tells the story of Alexander the Great. In the words of Chazal, his name was Alexander Macedon, Alexander the Macedonian. He was from Macedonia, Greece. And he wanted to conquer Yerushalayim. And the Kutim, who were the enemies, the adversaries of the Chachamim in Eretz Yisrael, they collaborated, they cooperated with Alexander and tried to convince him to fight the Jews and to destroy the Beis HaMikdash. And Alexander was on his way to Yerushalayim. And word comes to Shimon HaTzadik. Shimon HaTzadik dresses up in Bigdei Kohuna, and he goes out of the city to be Makabel Ponav Shel Alexander. And then something shocking unfolds. Alexander gets off his big stallion and bows down to Shimon HaTzadik. The Kutim were shocked and taken aback. And they asked Alexander, why are you bowing down to this person? He is your enemy, he is not your friend. And Alexander the Macedonian says, I know him. In all my battles, whenever I was victorious, this is the face, this is the man that goes before me and paves my way to victory. That's an amazing story, but the Gemara asks, what heter did Shimon HaTzadik have to dress up in Bigdei Kohuna out of the Beis HaMikdash? That is Moel Behegdish, it's an Issa Diuraisa. And the Gemara answers, Eis Laso Isla Hashem Eferes Erusecha. Why doesn't the Gemara say Pikuach Nefesh? Pikuach Nefesh has certain guidelines, has certain regulations and rules. The heter could not be based on Pikuach Nefesh because there were so many sfeikus. Shimon HaTzadik didn't really know what Alexander has in mind. He also could have no idea, would the big dick really make a difference? Would Alexander Bechlal notice what he's wearing? Would he be impressed or not? So the heter was not based on Pikuach Nefesh. The heter was based on the authority of a Godel B'Yisrael, a Manik B'Yisrael, to decide this is an Eis Lasis Hashem which justifies doing an Aveira. And that's what the Gemara says, Eis Lasis Hashem Eferes Erusecha. That was Heroas Shah. Maseh Shahoyu Kachoyu. An episode that happened once, limited in space and in time. But there's another suga which is far more significant, and that is in Tmuri Yudala Damid Beis. There's a fundamental halacha, Meikar Adin. Dvorim Shebechsav Yetor Shai Lomrim Barpeh, Dvorim Shebarpeh Yetor Shai Lomrim Bechsav. Torah Shebechsav needs to be written, and the oral Torah needs to be transmitted orally. And it's an aveda to write Torah Shebalpeh, according to the Chuvas Atashbetz, it's a Diuraisa. But in the days of Rabbeinu HaKodesh became aware, and other Chachmei saw together with him, if we don't write the Shas, the Torah will ultimately be forgotten. And they decided, Eis Lasesh L'Shem Eferes Erusecha. We have no other option. We must write the Torah. Mutav Shetiyekar Torah, V'al Tishtakech Torah Mi Yisrael. And that is also based on the principle of Eis Lasesh L'Shem Eferes Erusecha. Source number 4 is the Mishnah. and a Gemara increases Ches Medalef. The Gemara doesn't quote the Pasuk Eis Lasses L'Shem Afaresecho, but Rashi does, and so does Rabbeinu Ovadia. What's the story? What are we dealing with the Masechet Krisis? Korban Chatas that a Yoledes needs to bring and a Zava needs to bring. Kedei Lalot Metumah L'Tahara. If she had 5 children, she needs to bring 5 Korbanos, even though she accumulated them all, and she wants to bring a korban after all of 5 babies were born. She needs to bring 1 korban that will enable her lalot metumah l'tahara and to eat kachim, but she still needs to bring the other 4. So there's a huge demand on birds for the korbanos. Prices went up. Anybody that knows anything about any economical system knows that it all depends on demand and supply. So there was a huge demand for birds, for korbanos. Prices went up. Reb Shimon Gamliel darshaned, it's enough if you bring 1 korban, you don't need to bring 5. Prices came down, and when prices came down, Reb Shimon Gamliel once again taught them, no, you need to bring 5 different korbanos. Rashi and Rabbeinu Ovadia said, how did he paskin shaloi kaloch Eis Lasses L'Shem Afaresecho? In my opinion, this seems to be somewhat of a chiddush, because in the other sources of Aveda L'Shmo, Eis Lasses L'Shem, we're dealing with the salvation of Klal Yisrael, the salvation of Torah, Shaloi Tishtakach Mi Yisrael. This was just a financial problem, but on the other hand, wasn't really an Aveda, because yesh koyach biyad chachom mamlaka dovim and a Torah b'sheva ale ta'aseh. And on the other hand, they assume Reb Shimon Gamliel's plan in the first place was, after the prices will come down, he will once again teach all those people, all those women that they need to finish bringing the other korbanos. But nevertheless, these are the 4 sources in which, in 3 sources, it's a Mishnah and a Gemara. Source number 4, Rashi and Rabbeinu Ovadia. Yes, sometimes we are over an Aveira, when the reason we are over this Aveira is to achieve a cause that is far greater than the Chumrah of the Aveira that we committed. And in my opinion, Eis Lasses L'Shem Afaresecho and Gedol Aveira L'Shmo are the same. 2 sides of the same coin, just different expressions. Gedol Aveira L'Shmo is b'di'eved, like Esther, like Yoel Eishes Chever Hakeni. This is what happened. B'di'eved, yesh dor shel shevach, and we need to praise these people because, in retrospect, they did the right thing. Eis Lasses L'Shem Ezeheta L'Chatchila. But the concept is the same. Sometimes we do an Aveira when the goal we want to achieve by doing this Aveira is far greater and more important than the Chumrah of the Aveira. And now, after quoting 4 sugyas of Chazal, I want to go to Divrei Poskim, and I'm going to quote 10 different sources. And most of the sources I will quote now use the expression Gedol Aveira L'Shmo. Some of them Eis Lasses L'Shem, but I think fundamentally they're all the same. Tshuvas Harashbo Chelekei Simen Reish Lamed Ches. This tshuva is actually a Michtav Chizuk. I think it was one of the Talmidim of the Rashba, a Rav, a leader of a community that was very distressed because he wasn't successful in fighting the Porkei Oil, those that were Machal Shem Shemayim, they were over on mitzvahs, and he couldn't fight them. And the Rashba writes, not always could we hold the entire package. And sometimes the leader of a kehillah, of a community, need to look away. Not always could we be moichem ba'ovrei aveira. You need to see the bigger picture, writes the Rashba, and understand the end game, the result, the effects of what we do and what we abstain from doing. Va'al kegon eila amru gedola avera lishma. I don't think that Rashba really means the concept of avera lishma, because he's not dealing with doing an avera to achieve a greater goal. He's dealing with a situation in which we can't really fight them. I think what the Rashba means to convey is sometimes you need to ignore what you're doing or what you're not doing and just focus on the result. What will be the outcome in the long run? And that is what the Rashba means by quoting Gedol Avera Lishma. Tshuvas Haramosim in Yud Aleph, the Ramo also deals with a public issue and not a private one. So the Ramo deals with a machloikis in a certain kehillah, and there were two different parties. Obviously, it leaked out to the press, and the authorities got involved, and there was a danger that the authorities will expel all the Jews from the city and destroy the community. And the Ramo writes, to save the community and all its members, we should pick a side, the side we think is right. And he is mati elahoitzi shem ra, for the greater cause. And he also quotes Gedola Avera Lishma. Source number 3, which is similar to the first two, also Hanhoges Atzibur. Shalas Atshuvas Shvus Yankav Chelak Aleph Simen Yud Aleph. There was a kehillah in which too much was going on, and every other day another part, another individual was moicha, and there was so much strife and machloikis and shouting in the kehillah till the Rabbona made a cherem al haramas kol bebeis hakneses, and they decided in our shul, besides Torah and Tefillah, no one has the right to stand up and speak about politics. No one has the right to do machos. And after a certain period, one of the members of the community was pageya in the covet of the Morah da Asra, and another member just couldn't control himself, and he made a machoa al kavoid harav. And then he turned to the Shvus Yanka, who was the Gadol Hador. Do I need kapora? I was over on a cherem, and it's a terrible thing to be over on a cherem tziburi. And the Shvus Yankov writes, in these circumstances you did the right thing, because the covet of the Morah da Asra overrides the cherem and Gedola Avera Lishma. So 3 great Gedola, different circumstances, but all 3 tshuvas are dealing with Hanhoges Atzibur, and they all quote Gedola Avera Lishma. So obviously this concept does bear halachic relevance. Tshuvas Malach or Zerua, going back to the Rishonim, it's not a tshuva aloha lamaisa, but it's a pshat, and it's such an important pshat in the sugya we started the shir with. Nozich of Gimel Amid Beis. Lo ilam yasik odem etorah mitzvah shelo lishma metoch shelo lishma bo lishma. Tosfos asks, but another place in Shas the Gemara says, Alo mitzvah shelo lishma noach lo shelo nivra. So the interpretation of Tosfos, the teretz of Tosfos, and other Rishonim is there are 2 different types of shelo lishma. One is acceptable, b'di'evid, and the other should be totally rejected. Malach or Zerua has a different opinion, and he writes, every shelo lishma is an aveira, regardless what the nature of shelo lishma is. Every mitzvah shelo lishma is an aveira. But nevertheless, Chazal recommend la'olam yasa kodem Torah mitzvah shelo lishma metoch shelo lishma bo lishma, and that fits into the context of Gedola Avera Lishma. It is an Avera, but it's an Avera Lishma, because otherwise we won't do mitzvahs at all. So Chazal, with their ultimate wisdom, understood, if we don't legitimize an Avera Lishma, and if we don't legitimize doing mitzvahs shelo lishma, everything will fall apart. Everything will be lost. So according to Machar Zerua, most of our avodas Hashem fits into the context of Gedola Avera Lishma, because any mitzvah you do, which is not Bilti L'Shem Levadoi, which is not L'Shem Shemayim, is an Avera, but it is recommended because Gadol Avera Lishma. So that goes against Tosfos and most of the Rishonim, but it is an amazing and important interpretation. Brochas Beis Amud Aleph. Everybody tries to learn Tosfos, at least when you start Daf Yomi. So probably everybody remembers the first Tosfos in Shas, because every time we start Daf Yomi, a new cycle, many people hope this time around we'll learn with Tosfos. So even people that don't learn many Tosfos, probably most of you remember the very first Tosfos in Brochas. Tosfos deals with the question, why is our minhag to daven Maariv before Tzei Sakei Chovim? And Tosfos and all the other Rishonim following in Tosfos' footsteps offer two different explanations, two different interpretations. One is, we rely on Kriya Shema Shalamito, that we say before going to bed, which is obviously usually after Tzei Sakei Chovim. And the other approach is, we rely on Shittas Rav Yehuda, then from Plaga Mincha is already considered night. Sefer HaMichtam, one of the Rishonim, writes, no, we don't rely on Kriya Shema Shalamita, because the minhag is to say only the first posuk of the first parsha. And Ein Aloche Kereb Yehuda, Eis Lasois Lashem Heferus Serosecho. When the giants of the generation realized that people won't come to shul after Tzei Sakei Chovim, because as we see in many sugyas in Shas, after nightfall, in days of yore, people were afraid to leave their homes. It was considered a danger. And on the other hand, if we won't daven Maariv earlier, many people won't daven Maariv at all, and they won't learn Kriya Shema at all, and that is why Eis Lasos Lashem Heferus Serosecho, when the minhag is to daven an early Maariv, even though we are not yoytze the mitzvah of Kriya Shema Shel Arvis. And this brings us to Choshen Mishpot Reish Nun Vav in the Bach. So the Rambam Perik Tes Halacha Yud Hilchos Chiyuv Emetona writes an interesting halacha. Person before his demise, on his deathbed, a Shchiv Mara, asked part of his inheritance to be distributed to non-Jews. We don't fulfill his wish, because that is considered a prohibition and Avera. But if it says, please let my slaves free, we do fulfill his wish, even though the Gemara says, HaMashachar Avdoi over ba'asei. And it is also considered an Avera. And the Rambam writes, Mepnei she'eved chayiv b'miktzas mitzvahs. And the commentators of the Rambam don't understand. At the end of the day, this is an Avera, that's an Avera. The Bach, Choshen Mishpot Reish Nun Vav says, on one hand, you're not allowed to free slaves, but on the other hand, Evet chayiv b'mitzvahs ki'isho, and after you free him, he's chayiv in all the mitzvahs. So there is a positive side to this Avera, and it's Avera Lishma. This Bach doesn't fit in with all the other sources. And the other sources we saw, Avera Lishma, is you do an Avera, but the cause, the result you wish to achieve is far greater, is of utmost importance. Saving Klal Yisrael from annihilation, saving the Beis HaMikdash from destruction, preserving Torah, Shelo Tishtakach Torah Yisrael. We're dealing with a specific case of Matna Shchiv Mera. But anyway, I bring this quote because it's a Bach, and that is an important source. Noide be Yehuda Madura Tenyoni Yoredeis Makuf Samach Vav. We find a strange story in a certain kehillah. Whenever there was a bris, Chodesh Nisan, if it was a bris Shaloi Bismana, they pushed it off, they postponed it till Erev Pesach. And that is a clear violation of halacha. The moment you could circumcise a child, you have a chiyuv to do so. And why did they push it off to Erev Pesach? Because the B'chorim didn't want to fast. So this mitzvah don't have to fast. Strange minhag. And the Noide Yehuda says that we need to make a takana in this city, no Mila Shaloi Bismana Erev Pesach. And we push them all off to Chol HaMoed. That is a violation of halacha. But if the only way to stop this awful minhag, this ridiculous minhag of pushing off a bris of Pesach, so we should have Sudas Mitzvah and the B'chorim shouldn't have to fast, then it is our responsibility. The Noide Yehuda says, Choshev told me that 100 years ago, I didn't see this written anywhere, but I heard it from a very Choshev, that in America before the Holocaust, in many places, people pushed off all the bris, and even Mila Bismana, Sundays. People worked very hard, as we know, in America, and they were a bit lax in the observance of halacha. And Sunday is an off day. You don't go to work. So all the brisim were pushed off to Sunday. Well, I imagine that not all the ladies had babies on Sunday. So obviously it was convenient for people to push off the bris, and Rav Henken made a takana, no bris on Sunday, only if it's Mila Bismana. All the others will be pushed off to Monday. I don't know whether this appears in this form of Rav Henken. For some reason I don't have his form, even though I know the very chush of his form, so I never checked. But if the story is true, then I am quite confident that Rav Henken quoted and relied on the Noide B'Yehuda, which is a very similar story. Chuvas Chasam Soifer, Chelek Vav Simen Ches. And many times I spoke about this Chasam Soifer, Bal Peh and Bechsav. So the Chasam Soifer deals with a horrendous incident or episode, or story that happened in a certain town 200 years ago. So the Kehillah hired an artist to prepare a beautiful shar, a big sign, Zeh Shar Hashem Tzadikim Yevobo, and the intention was to put that in the entrance to the shul. And the artist wrote Zeh Shar Hashem Yud Kei Vav Kei. In the middle of the night, a Rosh Gomer came, and he came with Balei Malacha, and they fixed the sign in the Beis HaKisei, in the bathrooms. People came to daven in the morning, and they were shocked, and they were horrified to see Shem Hashem in the Beis HaKisei, and they turned to the Chasam Sofer. And the Chasam Sofer has a lengthy tshuva. He doesn't really come up with a heter, because we're dealing with an Issa Dioraisa. Ha-moichik shemes she'enam nimchokim lo ta'asin ken Hashem elokechem, and the Chasam Sofer writes, it is totally inconceivable, unacceptable, to have Shem Hashem in a Beis HaKisei, and everybody walking in and out will see that. Is there any greater bizoy and any greater Chil Hashem? So he writes, if we could have a goy to do Mechikas Hashem, preferable, but if not, even a Jew could do it. And this ruling is once again based on Gedoy Lavera Lishma. In other words, so from all these sources we clearly see, well, it is a relevant halacha. It is a relevant halacha. But only in very special cases. What's the principle? The way I see it, Psochim Nun Tes Omed Aleph. The Gemara says, when we have a contradiction between two mitzvahs to say, Korban Pesach is a say sheyesh by kores, or leu hashlem kol hakarbonos kulam, you're not allowed to bring any korban liachat tumen shel beinu abayim, is a mitzvah to say she'ein by kores. So a person is oilem et tumah l'tahara erev Pesach. He needs to bring a korban. Before he brings his korban, he can't eat kodshim. But it's already after tumen shel beinu abayim. The Gemara says, Yovei esa sheyesh b'kores v'yitches she'ein b'kores, and Tosa says, but it's not be'idna. When an Esa overrides a Lota, says it needs to be Be'idna. Be'idna de Masak Alav Mekayem Asay. In the very same moment that you're over the Lav, you need to perform the Mitzvah Asay. And in our case, it's not so. Because he needs to bring two Karbonas La'achar Tumet Shel Beinu Abayim, and the first one is not a Say Sheyesh Beikoros. He needs to bring the Kapora, he should be able to bring the Pesach. So by the time he brings the Pesach, he already violated the Mitzvah Asay. Tosis answers a very simple answer. Asay docha lo ta'aseh zegzeres hakosev, and we learn this halacha from kilayim betzitzis. So it needs to be dumia de kilayim betzitzis only beidna. Asay chamur docha asay kal is not zegzeres hakosev. It's a savora, and if it's a savora, you don't need beidna. If it's a savora, it doesn't matter whether it's immediate or not immediate. What we learn from Tosis is, whenever we have a stira, a contradiction between two mitzvahs, and we have no third way, it's either this or that, it's a savora. Le'olam hakal nitcha mepnei hachamur. The mitzvah chamura will always override and push aside the mitzvah kala. And that is exactly the concept of Gedoyla Avera Lishma. also known as Eis Lasis Hashem Afeinu Sorosecha. So when Yoel, Esther, Shimon HaTzadik realized that Klal Yisrael's future is at stake, annihilation of the people, destruction of Yerushalayim and the Beis HaMikdash, it was clear to them, yes, we need to be over and aveira to achieve the greater goal. The Rambam in Hilchos Mamrim doesn't deal exactly with this concept. The Rambam in Hilchos Mamrim explains the authority of a Navi to be oike duvim in a Torah, lemigda milse koiro asho, like a surgeon. Sometimes we amputate a limb, and the bystander that knows nothing about medicine sees doctors cutting away an arm, a leg, a foot, and he says how cruel these people are, stealing a limb from a live person. But they don't understand this is the way to save his life, and it's an act of mercy. It is the same when we are confronted with a situation in which it's either this or that. So is this halacha l'maisa? The Netziv deals with this question twice in his amazing form. Hamek dover parshas devorim, meishav dover shalas etshuvas chelik beisim and tes, and the Netziv gives two principles. Number one, bo'u v'nachshav cheshboinoi shel olam, ma chomer v'ma kal. And only Gedol Yisrael could decide what are the circumstances, what are the situations in which we say, yes, this overrides that. And it is justified to be over an isur diurais and avera shel Torah for a greater goal. You need to be a godly bisul to decide what is that greater goal. And the other point that Netziv makes is the person that makes this decision needs to be noki mekol negia umekol pnia, totally unbiased, totally shem shemaim. If he has any interest or he could derive any benefit from that decision, he cannot make that decision. Those are the two principles that the Netziv is koiveya. So I think today we had a very, very interesting shir. It's an interesting concept, and we brought many sources to develop some klolim. And I just want to share a short thought about the Kedas Yitzchak. What was the Nesoyin? And many ask. Thousands of Jews gave their lives on Kiddush Hashem. There must be something unique and special about a Kedas Yitzchak, and I think there is. Kiddush and Lamed Vav Amud Aleph, there's a machlokes Rabbi Yehuda Reb Meir. When are we called Bonim and when are we called Avodim? So Rabbi Yehuda says, Bizman she'oisen retzoyin shemukum kriyim Bonim, ein oisen kriyim Avodim. And Reb Meir says, we're always Bonim. The Zohar Kodesh has a unique interpretation of Parshas Bahar, and the Zohar says, there is no contradiction at all between Bonim and Avodim. Each and every Jew, every moment of his life, needs to be a Ben plus an Eved. We love a Kodesh Baruch Hu because we are his children. We are in awe of a Kodesh Baruch Hu because we are his servants. We are always Bonim and always Avodim. And Bonim and Avodim are a reflection, a manifestation of Ahavo v'Yira, defined in the Zohar, Dechilu urechimu. We love because we're sons. We fear because we're slaves. What is the essential difference in Hanhoga between a son and a servant? In the relationship between fathers and children, children are entitled, if it's a normal functioning family, to ask questions. And when a father tells a son, I want you to do this and that, the son has the privilege to ask, Abba, why do you think this is important? You know, could I share my thoughts with you? A child is entitled to ask, and his father probably would try to answer and explain. A slave doesn't ask questions. We don't want him to ask questions. A soldier doesn't question his commanders. He's supposed to obey commands. A great commander, for some reason I don't want to mention his name, once he was an admiral, commanded his ship in combat, and he says, ours is to do and die. Ours is not to ask why. So a soldier doesn't question orders. A servant, a slave, doesn't ask questions, but a son does. Avraham Avinu was the greatest Ohev Hashem. The Rambam writes so in Perek Yud of Hilchos Shuvah. Perek Yud Hilchos Shuvah is dedicated to Avodas Hashem Yahweh. And the Rambam says, Loi kol hachachomim zochu lema'ala zu. That is the special Maila of Avraham Avinu. The Novi Yeshayahu says, Zera Avraham Ohavi. HaKadosh Baruch Hu defines Avraham Avinu, Avraham Ohavi. Nisoynu Akeda was, Ha'im Ahavu Yesera Mekalkeles Es Ashura. Could Avraham rise to the challenge of Yira? Is his Yiras Hashem as great as his Ahavas Hashem? That was the Nisoyan. So Avraham gets the strangest mitzvah he could ever imagine. Slaughter your son. And he has 1,000 questions racing in his mind. How could this be? Kadosh Baruch Hu promised me, I was 99 years old, and a malach told me, he promised me a son, and now he's asking me to kill my son. Obviously, I think Avraham Avinu, I imagine, also remembers the Gemara Megillah Daf Daled. Chazal speak negatively about the Yiftach HaGelodi that sacrificed his daughter and killed her as a sacrifice. Ovdei Avodah Zorah had a molech. They brought human sacrifices. That's totally against mitzvah Torah. We don't bring human sacrifices. And Chazal clearly say that, based on a posuk in Novi and Megillah Daf Daled. What would be more natural for Avraham Avinu, Ohev Hashem, to turn to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and say, may I ask a question, Rabbeinu Shalom? Please explain to me, how could this be? You promised me, and how about, I've dedicated my life to fight Avodah Zorah. What will the Goyim say when Avraham Avinu sacrifices his son? So why did I attack all the others for doing so? Why didn't he ask? He didn't ask because his yira is as great as his ahava, and that is why the Malach calls out to Avraham, Atu yodati ki yarei Elokim atu. Nobody ever questioned your ahava, but now you proved that you're as great in yira as you are in ahava. That was the Nisoyin of the Akedah. And it just brings to mind the importance of the combination ahavo ve'yira, dechilu urechimu. The combination of the two are the essence of avodas ukenu. Yerotzen sheniske lakach. So I once again ask everyone to daven for my mother, Fladel Baslea. She's not in a good place. Kodesh Baruch Hu shlach lefuas and Yeshuas, and also for Rabbi Yochanan Hillel ben Tova Zelda. Kodesh Baruch Hu should send them a for Shleimim and a Shemayim.